First, I'd like to thank the Nod Pragas for organizing this symposium. And I'd like to especially thank our honored guests, Professor Oberoi, Dr. Gill, Dr. Balkar Singh, and Dr. Randhawa for gracing us with their presence today. As one of Professor Mandair's senior students, it's a great honor for me to be able to come here and have the opportunity to humbly present my thoughts on the book. This book has been in many ways breakthrough for students of Sikhi, both in the West and also here in Punjab and in India, and in the wider academy, also in Europe and other places. It's been received in a variety of different contexts, and it's begun an important conversation, and I think that was one of Professor Mandair's main intentions in writing the book, is to begin a new avenue, a new productive kind of conversation, to think about Sikhi and think about the history of the Sikh Panth in different kind of ways. So there are very few people today who would say that Sikhi is in a good state of health. Indeed, Sikh history of the last 150 years or so can be seen as a succession of crises that began with the advent of colonialism and the annexation of Punjab in 1849, the crises of religious identity fostered by that colonial context that gave rise to the advent of and the need for the establishment of the Singh Sabha in the 1870s, and their activities, publications, and systems of ideas that continued to develop over the next half century or so. Next, because of mismanagement of gurdwaras and other colonial forms of oppression, there was a need for concerted action, which gave rise to the Gurdwara reform movement in the teens and 20s of the last century. Although the Gurdwara reform movement was largely successful, the years of leading up to Indian independence in the 30s and 40s were marked by a futile succession of attempts at negotiation to mark out an autonomous territory for Sikhs on par with Pakistan and Hindustan. And we all know in the catastrophic upheaval that came after partition, that was marked by the struggle of the Sikh Panth to find new ways of thinking of itself and organizing itself within a new context of the Indian nation state. This struggle led in the 50s and 60s to the Punjabi Suba Morcha, this attempt to establish a Punjabi linguistic state, which finally culminated in 1966 in the heavily truncated, newly developed state of East Punjab. So all the series of unresolved issues that were left over from the establishment of Punjabi Suba in 1966 were addressed in an Anandpur Sahib resolution in 1973. This resolution prompted the cynical and political maneuvering and manipulation of the Congress Party, which culminated in the events of 1984, Operation Blue Star, and in its aftermath, the massacres of Sikhs in New Delhi, which in turn was followed by the militarized state of Punjab in the decade following 1984. The aftermath of that decade has led us to the crises of today: environmental degradation, lack of opportunities, including intellectual opportunities, and the ability and opportunity for youth of Punjab to think critically and act upon those issues that are facing them, and the advent of drug abuse and other problems in Punjab today. So we can see these Sikhi and the Sikh Panth have clearly endured a lot of problem since the advent of colonialism, though there have been some high points, notably the Singh and all the scholarship that came out of that, and the Gurdwara reform movement. We can also see our history over the last 150 years as a series of trying situations and tragedies, particularly in the post-independence period. When we were ostensibly out from under the burden of colonialism, but anyone who has any kind of interest in Sikh history and the development of the Sikh Panth knows all of these events, all of the events of this narrative intimately. There's been abundant scholarship on what happened and when, but unfortunately to date there has been less scholarship on why these things happen. Exactly what led to these situations again and again. How do we as a Sikh Panth find ourselves in these situations over and over again? So Religion and the Spector of the West, Professor Mandair's first major work, is in some measure an attempt to identify and explain the deep philosophical and ideological structures that have led to Sikhs finding themselves in these recurrent predicaments time and time again. Though they seem to be different kind of predicaments occurring at different points in history, as Professor Mandair points out, indeed there is a kind of structural logic that determines the placement of Sikhi within similar kinds of frameworks over and over again. Thereby, Religion and the Spector of the West gives us a set of intellectual tools whereby we can analyze recent events of Sikh history with a kind of explanatory clarity. So this book also opens up new ways of thinking about several key questions within the ambit of Sikh studies and beyond, and hopefully begin some productive conversations in the years ahead. And this, I believe, will be the two of the enduring legacies of the book. So anyone who has had a chance to look at the book, it's a huge compendium, it's a sprawling book. So I can't hope in this brief talk to do any justice to all the topics that are present in the book. So for today's lecture, I'll just focus on one major aspect that is a thread that runs through all of the chapters in the book. And that's the concept of ideology and its relation to frameworks of interpretation. So I'm going to speak a little bit about ideology. I'll focus on that. And I'll give you some concrete examples of Professor Mandair's analysis of ideology and its relation to interpretive frameworks. So by ideology here, I mean a system of ideas or beliefs that inform frameworks of interpretation. The important thing to remember about ideology is that it serves as a lens or a filter that enables us to see certain things. At the same time, it hinders us from seeing other things. So it's a way of paying close attention to certain features which necessarily means that we cannot equally pay equal attention to other features. One of the ways that ideology works is that, or frameworks of interpretation work, is that they work invisibly. And the ideological, or frameworks of interpretation often work invisibly, and their ideological basis or underpinnings are often obscure. This is not to say that there is no ideology informing them, but rather to say that all traces of that ideology are erased, which then lends the appearance of naturalness to the framework. It appears that the framework arises from nature itself and is not a construction. So indeed, the comparative world religions framework that I'll discuss in a few moments fits into this mold. It appears to conform naturally to phenomena that exist in the world. But we find historically, and this is one of the key points of Professor Mandair's book, is to trace the origins of this comparative framework. And we find that it's just barely 200 years old. So it's not very old at all. And yet it's still intact and in place today, the comparative religion framework. So in essence, we have a socially determined thought that either is not aware of, or in some cases even denies its own social determinism. So power works most effectively when it is invisible, and through the illusion of non-coercion. So it seems like we're not being coerced, and yet we accede to this framework unconsciously. That's important to keep in mind. So we need to examine how we are pre-reflectively bound up in ideologies. That is, how we unconsciously subscribe to ideologies that are often not of our own making. We should not confuse ideology with idealism. Although ideology is made up of ideas, these ideas do not exist only in the abstract. Rather, they have very real and material social effects, even deadly effects in some cases. So, in looking at ideology, we need to examine the who, the what, and the why of ideology. So the first two, who is creating an ideology and what that ideology is, those are relatively simple to determine. But we get the most intellectual knowledge from critically examining why a particular ideology has arisen and what conditions enable that ideology to come into being. In critiquing ideology, there are two main types of critiques. One is called immanent critique. In an immanent critique, we accept the terms and the categorical logic of a system in order to critique it. The second kind of critique is called a radical critique, which seeks to locate itself, not inside or outside of a system, but rather within its very contradictions. And I would say that Religion and Spector of the West is an example of the latter kind of critique, a radical kind of critique, which seeks to find itself within and expose contradictions within ideological frameworks. So the first type of ideology I want to talk about is the ideology of religion. So what is religion? And what is the Spector of the West, according to Religion and the Spector of the West? So Professor Mandair takes us back to early 19th century German philosophy, especially Hegel, the figure of Hegel. Hegel has been an enduring influence in Western philosophy up until today, and especially the framework of comparative world religions that he created in the 1810s and 1820s is still intact today. We still operate under the framework of comparative world religions in the West and in the East as well. So that's why Professor Mandair takes us back to that moment, that creation of the comparative world religion framework. It's also important to remember that Hegel was in dialogue with his contemporaries of the time, other German philosophers, and especially he was in dialogue with other German Indologists, people who were studying India, studying the literature of India, studying the history of India. And his development of his philosophy was essentially a reaction to other German Indologists. So that's important to remember. So this framework that he created is not arising out of a vacuum, but it's particularly in reaction to the intellectual conversation that he's having at the time. So the German Indologists and other Indologists, especially from Great Britain at the time, began by engaging in the practice of philology, especially study of Sanskrit, also Persian and Arabic, the classical languages of India. Through this investigation, they uncovered the connection between the Indic languages, ancient Indic languages, Sanskrit, Persian, Sanskrit especially, and Western European languages. So they discovered that there's a connection an ancient connection between India and Europe, which until that time it wasn't popularly known. This created a problem for those who were thinking about the origin of things like religion and culture. Because previously, in a European framework, without the comparative model of India and Sanskrit, it's easy to think about Europe and Christianity as the oldest and also the highest form of civilization. But now we have evidence of a civilization that was much older, had a much longer attested literature than European literature. So the oldest attested written literature is of course, Sanskrit literature. So this provided a great challenge to the European self-conception. You have now a rival right at the beginning, right at the origin of civilization, at the origin of culture, at the origin of religion. So this is what the philosopher Hegel is responding to, this challenge. Who owns the origin of civilization? Who owns the origin of religion, etc.? So in his reaction to this finding of German Indologists, he develops a system whereby he can evaluate all the world's religions according to a scale. He develops a scale along which those religions that have the ability to divide themselves into subject and object, that is to objectify themselves, to elevate themselves, those form the highest point in the hierarchy of religions. This includes, of course, his own religion. German Protestant Christianity is at the top of the hierarchy. Next are religions that he calls have inconsistent elevation. They're not quite able to elevate themselves, and yet he can't deny that they have written literature. This includes, Vedic religion, Sikhi, Chinese religions, and so on. So they're semi-elevated, but not as high as German Protestantism. And then Islam, of course, also has a written tradition. Then below those are those religions that have no written tradition and no process of self-elevation. So these religions are thereby arranged in this hierarchy. And we see this framework still in place today when we think about religions. It's almost impossible to think about religions outside of the framework of this comparative framework. And what Religions in the Spector of the West points out is that we are constantly acceding to this framework whenever we enunciate ourselves as Sikhs. So next, it seems I'm running out of time, so I'll try to go through these quickly. The next is in the ideology of language. So language is a very complex phenomenon. It can be analyzed on many different levels, whether that be syntactic, morphological, and so on and so forth. Professor Mandair introduces the concept of what he calls monolingualism. The world as it is characterized by religious multiplicity, or linguistic multiplicity. Multilingualism is and has been the norm everywhere in the world. So monolingualism is a very rare phenomenon. It only occurs in very special situations, like an island or a very isolated culture. So how do we get in this context where we accede to this concept of monolingualism, especially in a place like India, which is one of the most linguistically diverse places in the entire world? And we see the difficulty of enforcing the idea of monolingualism in a place as diverse as India when we look at linguistic states. Even to this day, there are new linguistic states developing every few years. We saw Chhattisgarh several years ago, Jharkhand, and just this year, last year, I think Telangana, the movement for Telangana is coming. So this idea that a single mono language can conform spatially to a single territory is a very unnatural relationship, and it's virtually impossible to enforce. So how do we get to this stage where monolingualism becomes an important idea within Sikhi? So, as Professor Mandair writes, monolingualism as an idea arose in this very diverse linguistic context in India through the colonial intervention, the attempt to stabilize the fluidity of Indian languages according to a single model, which was the model of English. So, languages in India came to be measured by their conformity or proximity to English. So English, in this way, serves as a transcendent signifier against which all other languages are measured. Again, speakers are forced then to accede into this model by enunciating that they are speakers of a single language, say Punjabi or Hindi. So I'm willing to wager that there is no one in this audience today who is a monolingual speaker of any language. Everyone here is at least bilingual, and I'm quite confident that we have many people who speak 3 or 4 or 5 or 6 languages here. So the idea of monolingualism is a very artificial idea. There's no one here who is actually monolingual. So what effect does this ideology of monolingualism have on our self-conception and the way we have to present ourselves? This is one of the issues that Professor Mandair touches in the book. So lastly, I'll briefly talk about his idea about Vedic economy. So the Vedic economy, as mentioned in Religion and Spector of the West, is essentially an ideology that privileges orality and the world of sound as the ontological ground for all phenomena, including writing. So the Vedic economy has been conceptualized, especially by Western social scientists, as an essential element of South Asian identity. So as it's shown in Religion and Spector of the West, the Vedic economy itself obscures the privileging of one particular linguistic formation, that is, the Sanskrit linguistic formation, over all others, and conceals an essentially exclusionary ideology, which is marked by inaccessibility to the master signifier of Sanskrit. In other words, Sanskrit learning and knowledge has historically been restricted to a particular class, the Brahminical class. So it's interesting that Western social science scholars have deployed the Vedic economy as a means that they consider to be a means of anti-imperialism by giving back the colonized people their pre-colonial modes of repetition. In other words, give them back orality and the privileging of orality. But what this obscures, of course, is that this places us within what Professor Mandair has described as the Vedic economy. And as Professor Mandair has marked out in the book, Sikhi provides a very interesting case when we talk about the privileging of either orality or textuality. Because within Sikhi, orality and textuality have an equal place. There's no privileging of sound as the ontological ground, neither is there a privileging of writing. Both are equally important. So as Professor Mandair writes, Sikhi conforms neither to the model of ethical monotheism, which duplicates the dualism of Western metaphysics, nor does it accede to the Vedic theo-ideology of eternal Sanskrit. The presence of rag within Granth Sahib indicates a form of objectivity that cannot be reduced to the operations of reflective consciousness or conceptual thought. So musical subjectivity also avoids the metaphysical operation of the splitting of the sensuous and the intelligible. So both are regarded as a unity within Sikhi. So it provides a very interesting case which shows us and exposes the ideology, the dualistic ideology of that you have to privilege either sound or textuality, either orality or textuality. Sikhi provides a perfect case where this split ideology is not tenable by actual facts on the ground. Its ideology is just a series of ideas that we've deployed. It's a framework that we're deploying. But what does that prevent us from seeing? That's what his goal is in that, analyzing the Vedic economy. So I've gone far over my time, so I'll just wrap up. I've just begun to touch on a few of the major topics in this voluminous text. Among the many things I have not talked about are the idea of translation, which is a critical part of the book, the development of Sikh theology, which is also a critical part, and especially the implications and the potential of these new ways of thinking through theory for intervening in the Western Academy and also for our self-understanding as a Sikh Pandit. What are the implications of new ways of thinking? How can this transform our self-understanding? So hopefully through this book and through thoughtful responses to this book and a new productive conversation will be. Waheguru Ji Ka Khalsa, Waheguru Ji Ki Fateh.